So we enter into Advent. This is the second week of Advent. Advent comes from the Latin word adventus, meaning coming. Advent is meant to be a time to actually slow down, to contemplate, to wait with an expectant hope. But it's also the Christmas season. And sometimes the Christmas season feels kind of like this picture I have here, especially if you have kids. But I think for all of us, it can kind of seem hectic, right? And I think here you have mom who's just kind of jumping in and for a camera. But how many times, if you've been around kids, if you had little kids, that you feel like, oh, I wish I could do that right now. I feel like I just want to break down with you guys, except for I feel like I have to adult right now and try to grow up. The Christmas season can often feel so busy and chaotic and crazy. Just for the record, by the way, today is December 4th, so there's exactly 21 days until Christmas. Sorry to bring that pressure on you. There's 3 weeks from today until Christmas comes. I'm like, oh. So November comes and then it speeds up. Thanksgiving comes really quickly, and then right after that is December. And then Christmas is coming, and there's all of these things happening. And I was talking to my wife recently and just sharing kind of my feelings of being overwhelmed and thinking of church stuff and work stuff and my kids' schools and what's going on with the holiday season there, and they get off early before my wife gets off, and so what are we going to do to entertain them and find a place for them? And then you have finances that you're dealing with too, and Christmas gifts that you're trying to struggle with, and then if you're in school, like my wife and I too, it's finals, and all these things kind of collide during this Christmas season, and I was feeling kind of overwhelmed, and almost felt like I was hyperventilating a little bit, oh my gosh, just breathe. And I felt like, man, I don't want to just make it through. I don't want to just say, how do I make it through? Sometimes during this holiday season, especially Christmas season, it feels like the rapids of life are just getting faster and faster and faster, and we're holding on so much. We just don't want to look like this guy here. We're like, God, just hold on, just make it through. I don't want to lose it, right? If you've seen the kids' movie Finding Nemo, Dory in there, she has this phrase that she says over and over, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, She tells herself, just keep swimming, and that's what I felt like, okay, just hold on and just make it through. There's got to be a light at the end of this tunnel. Only in talking to my wife and just feeling all this angst within me, I was like, I don't want to just make it through this time, right? I don't want to be one of those where it's just hold on and just get through. And so I've been learning and relearning and learning again and again that when life gets crazy and chaotic, that there has to be a way to go under all of that, to find the calm underneath it all, to dive down beneath just the rush and just the chaos, the busyness, the angst, the anxiety, the consumerism, just feeling that bombardedness of work and Christmas and all of these things going on. But how do we get under? How do we find the calm? I like this picture as he's diving underneath the water. It's something that I often wrestle with time and time again. How do I find that calm underneath the storm? Because when life gets chaotic and crazy, there's calm. It's just underneath the surface. And it takes intentionality to find that underneath the surface. I want to read a short excerpt from a Pilgrim's Almanac. And you can follow along on the screen. It says, take time to be aware that in the very midst of our busy preparations for the celebration of Christ's birth in ancient Bethlehem, Christ is reborn in the Bethlehems of our homes and daily lives. Take time, slow down, be still, be awake to the divine mystery that looks so common and so ordinary, yet is wondrously present. An old abbot was fond of saying, the devil is always the most active in the highest feast days. The supreme trick of Old Scratch is to have us so busy decorating, preparing food, practicing music, cleaning in preparation for the feast of Christmas, that we actually miss the coming of Christ. Hurt feelings, anger, impatience, injured egos, the list of clouds that busyness creates to blind us to the birth can be long, but it's familiar to all of us. Impatience is one of those, that during this time I feel, and realizing it's also heightened, I think, not to bring politics up again, but because of the political season, all of this stuff is heightened emotionally. And now we're entering into the Christmas season, and it's just getting busier and busier. How do we go deeper during this time? How do we not just make it through? How do we make sure we don't miss the way Christ is reborn in the Bethlehems of our lives and then those around us? The next slide here is a picture of the church calendar. I did not grow up in a tradition that really followed the church calendar, sometimes called the Christian calendar or the liturgical year. How many of you are from a tradition that not just touched on it here and there, but actually followed this calendar? How many of you guys are from a tradition that did that? So there's a few of you here. I'm finding actually that this is one of the ways to dive underneath the chaos of life. It's a different way of telling time. It's not just the Christmas season, but it's Advent. It's going deeper beneath all of that. And so just a background for those of us that didn't grow up with this tradition, Advent is actually the beginning of the church calendar. It doesn't begin with Christmas or the New Year. It begins with Advent, which is this longing, this time where we're longing for the birth of Christ. And so Advent, our year begins with this longing and waiting. Can we go back to that slide? And then we continue Christmas, obviously, which Christmas is 12 days long. Somebody will make a note of that in a video I have here too. It's a celebration. So Christ is born, Jesus is born. Epiphany is that time of realizing that Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one. And then we go into Lent, then Holy Week, Easter, Pentecost. And then a large part of it is season after Pentecost, or what many people call ordinary time. And what I found actually is this is a way to shape our lives differently, to tell time, to schedule, to have a rhythm to our lives that's different. I'm not against saying Christmas season or Merry Christmas or any of those things. I'm not against that at all. But what I'm suggesting is that maybe there is a different way to orient our lives. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we orient our life? Advent is a season of anticipation. It's a longing of something we sense is coming, but is not yet arrived, right? We're getting prepared for the birth of Jesus. It's a time of longing, anticipation. Something is coming, but it's not yet here. We're preparing ourselves, which is really almost the exact opposite of what Christmas season is for so many people, which is about doing and getting more done in the busyness and chaos of life. It looks very different when you enter in, and how do I anticipate? How do I create my life in a way that orients around this hopeful anticipation? In some ways, we're entering also into the long history of a Judeo-Christian tradition of what I'll call prophetic longing. In much of the Hebrew Bible, prophets, we'll talk about prophets here in a moment too in more detail, but prophets are those who often were contemplative and saw into the future of what was coming or what could be. And I just wanted to read together this morning an excerpt out of Isaiah, chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And in verse 2, it says, "In the days to come." So here the prophet is envisioning a future, of something in the future that is coming. It's an anticipation, a longing. He's painting a picture of what can be. "In the days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of mountains, shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, 'Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." The prophet here is envisioning a future of, in that time, what people would do is go to the mountain of God. They would go to the presence of God, which was found in the mountaintops. They would go. And so the prophet Isaiah is envisioning a future of a great number of people coming to hear Yahweh, to learn, to be instructed, which is probably a better translation. Sometimes we hear the word Torah, and it gets translated law, but maybe a better translation would be instructions in how to live. And so here the prophet is saying there's a whole group of people gathering around this mountain, hearing the instructions of Yahweh and actually going out and doing that. And what would that look like, right? It would look like war no more. It would look like people beating their swords into plowshares. It would look like peace. It would look joyful. It's a prophetic longing of what could be. And yet, I think for many of us, we're surrounded by the very real reality that we're full of racism in our country, in our nation, in our world, sexism, bigotry, hatred, violence. And so sometimes it can be hard. How do we have this imagination, this longing for what could be, when sometimes around us it's so hard to see anything like that? Anybody else here struggle with impatience, which is heightened? Yeah, thank you. Which is heightened during this time, isn't it? With everything else that's going on, we become more impatient. And Advent invites us into a different way of being in the world. Advent is a season of anticipation, longing, something we sense is coming, but has not yet arrived. And the hope of this anticipation is actually born in contemplation. It's born in prayer. It's born in taking time and setting aside time. Otherwise, we just get sucked into the consumerism that surrounds us. Being a person of faith is meant to be subversive and countercultural, in that we live to a different rhythm. We're not sucked in to the same consumerism and impatience that pulls on us. So Advent is an invitation to take time to contemplate, to pray, to see a little bit more clearly. And actually, artists and creatives are some of the most natural contemplatives. Because an artist is somebody, say a photographer, is somebody who pays attention to all the details, all the different kinds of lighting, who sees what would be the best angle to capture this. So they take the time to gaze into, to contemplate, to look at from different angles, right? Artists are some of the most natural contemplatives of our time. Perhaps there's something we can learn today. The next, here is a picture of actually, we took a road trip, my family and I, a few years ago. We took a road trip from Colorado to Wisconsin, and on our way back, we stopped at this great monument, Mount Rushmore. How many of you guys have ever visited Mount Rushmore? People are like scared to raise their hands now. Like, sorry guys. So a few of you visited Mount Rushmore. One of the things that's interesting is it's a lot farther back than you think of when you see pictures. So it's kind of set back in there. But Mount Rushmore took 14 years to build. And it actually took, it was proposed in 1923 and not started until 1927. And I have a feeling, I don't know the exact statistics, but when it was proposed, I imagine they had to have some sort of drawing or scale. So they had some sort of preparational work before that, proposed it, and then 4 more years of preparation, and then 14 years of work to create this. So somebody spent a lot of time in contemplation, in preparation, in looking at the different angles. 400 people worked on this. They moved a total of 450,000 tons of rock in order to make this monument. It was dangerous, of course. Most of it, 90% of it, was carved using dynamite. And as you can see here, these are what they call bosun chairs in creating this. So they would lower them down with like 3/4 inch cables, and they would pound and chisel in and place the dynamite in the areas, and then all of them, of course, would have to be raised up, and then they would blow the area around them. And it took 400 men, often many of them getting paid, I think it was like $8 an hour or something, living off of these cliffs day in and day out. For 14 years it took to build this thing. So somebody took an enormous amount of time and input into creating this thing. A couple of interesting facts. The original design was meant to be a picture of each of the presidents all the way down to their waist. So that didn't happen. Time and funding interrupted that. And also, the next slide here I have, you can see, is there one more? Let's go to the next one. So you can see here, actually, the beginning phases. That's George Washington. And then to the left there is Thomas Jefferson. That was the original design. But on the left, the rock was so unsturdy that they decided they had to basically erase it and put Thomas Jefferson on the other side. So let's go back to that other slide I have. So we have Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and then Theodore Roosevelt there in the middle. And so not only did it take a lot of time, but they had to adjust accordingly, which all great, I think, artists, creatives know. You set out and you need to adjust accordingly. And you can actually see there, just to the left of George Washington, where the face used to be, of Thomas Jefferson. We're not going to talk a lot about the idea of nomad. Nomad is the title of our Advent series. We're going to get into this more in the weeks to come. But a nomad is someone who actually lives by the seasons. In a sense, it's a seasonal person who moves about according to the seasons. And part of this is understanding, too, in life, there's different seasons of our life. And I'm finding that more and more helpful for me as I understand life, because there's different seasons of life. And that's part of the Advent and part of the church calendar, is realizing there's different seasons. And also life as a journey. Sometimes you set out to create something in a certain way, and it doesn't go as planned, which is probably most of our lives, right? We set out to do something, to get into a job, and then that job falls through, and then we end up going somewhere else. Or we enter into school thinking, oh, this is the way I want to go, and then we find out, I'm not so good at this, and I don't really like these classes, and so we finagle our way and eventually find ourselves maybe doing something very different than we had originally planned. Patience, flexibility, these things. Contemplatives, artists, and creatives are natural contemplatives. But also, prophets are first, I think, contemplatives as well. We read a little excerpt from the Gospel of Matthew that talked about John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was a fiery preacher, of course, a prophet of his own right. And I want to invite you to read with me just a part of that again. In chapter 3, verse 11, it says, John the Baptist is saying, I baptize you with water for repentance, but one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I am not worthy to carry his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. So here we have John, a little bit older than Jesus, probably in his early 30s. He's out baptizing people in the Jordan River, doing an obscure thing, kind of on the fringe, right? And he somehow was aware of the season that he was entering into. Somehow he was aware of what was going on, and God was birthing and bringing forth that there was this Messiah coming. And I would suggest to you, I think he was aware of the season and the time because he was a contemplative first and foremost, because he took the time in prayer and the time in silence and the time to gaze, patiently waiting and expecting and opening himself up to what might God be doing and saying. There's a few different groups in scriptures. Today we talked about, as Maria read, about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Those were two of the religious leaders in the first century. There's also another group that we don't often talk about much. They were the Essenes. And the Essenes were ascetic separatists who lived in private communities. Now, the Christian scriptures don't name them out directly, but we know that they existed in the first century. And roughly in the same area as actually John the Baptist baptized. The Essenes lived a very separate life, a contemplative life. They followed strict dietary laws, rigorous holy codes of conduct, some of them incorporating celibacy. They had sacred meals similar to how Christians celebrate baptism and the Eucharist, and they had ritual bathing periods at times as well during the day. Some scholars have thought that John the Baptist could have been an Essene or was influenced by this group of people. The next slide here we have, it's just a map that gives us just an idea. Qumran, is a group of caves, and I'll say more about that in a moment. But that red area to the left of the Dead Sea here is a group of caves where it's believed there was a small community of Essenes that lived in that area. And you can see the waterway north of the Dead Sea is actually the Jordan River, and it connects to the Sea of Galilee north there. John the Baptist baptized in the Jordan River, probably somewhere just a little bit north of where it is that we can see there. So we can almost tell it's on the fringe of, you see Jerusalem there, Bethlehem, Jericho, it's on the fringe of where most people lived. John the Baptist might not have been in a scene. He might have been in the scene, but he was in close proximity to this group of people. N.T. Wright, who's a New Testament scholar, says that this group, or many within this group, was actually expecting a Messiah in the first century. So they were living in a contemplative life in sense, what is God doing in our world today? And N.T. Wright suggests that maybe some of the early John the Baptist disciples were actually Essenes, as they would have been anticipating this Messiah and walking out and obviously living close to them. Here's the next slide, gives us just an idea of what the area looks like. This is some of the Qumran caves. The Qumran caves were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin teenager. I think he was young. I think he was a teenager. But he was looking for a lost animal and wandered out into one of these caves. And he discovered what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're ancient manuscripts. And since that discovery, there's been many other scrolls in other caves, a total of 11 caves in that area, and many different scrolls, some of them segments, some of them whole scrolls, where we have now found part of all the books in the Hebrew Bible, or one of the scrolls had all of them, some of them had all of them, so pieces or the whole writings of all of the books in the Hebrew Bible, except I think Esther, are found in these, just stumbling upon it by some Bedouin person looking for an animal. This is a picture, I think this is Cave 4, which is one of the more popular ones now. You can go visit that. That's what the inside looks like. So these Essenes lived in this kind of environment. I just find this fascinating. I think it's helpful for us sometimes to realize too, like, this is actual people living in actual places, and this is what it looked like. Somewhat like Phoenix, area. So interesting enough. This here is the Jordan River. So this gives us an idea of where John the Baptist would have been baptizing people out there. Again, on the fringe, we get this idea of a kind of a wild, fiery prophet, ate locusts and honey and dressed in camel's hair, kind of a fringe person. Contemplatives are often fringe people. They're often ones that spend time in solitude and silence, and perhaps there's a lot we can learn from prophets and from artists and from creatives in taking the time to gaze a little bit more, taking the time to see what others often pass by, which is an invitation for us to enter into this season. And what ways can we do that? What ways could we enter into this season more intentionally? So I just have on the next slide just a few ways that we can do that. These are very practical, very easy ways that we can actually enter into this time in a more contemplative, intentional way. Perhaps it's an Advent devotional or a meditation. One of my favorites is very, very small, very simple. This is an Advent meditation. Richard Rohr is one of my favorites. And I've done this for the past 3 or 4 years. And it only takes like 2 minutes to read through. But it's one way to enter into this season with a contemplative mindset and opening yourself up to what is God doing in this time, in this season of my life. And there's others out there. I know I've heard Dietrich Bonhoeffer has one too that I've never read, but I heard he has another one. But there's other specific Advent meditations, devotionals that help us. Another one is to take extra time in the morning to slow down, to not be in such a big hurry, which is what the Christmas season often pushes us to do. Be in a hurry, moving from place to place. Create margins in our life, which means that if you have to go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, then it doesn't mean staying up till 1 o'clock, right? And then you're rushing out the door at 8:30 trying to get there, already stressed, right? Maybe it's setting aside time to enjoy long meals. Again, these are just simple things. I was trying to think of what are ways that we, in the modern era, can just tweak ourselves a little bit, where it's not time-consuming in a already busy schedule, but we just tweak things just a little bit. Enjoy long meals. So that's something my family and we talked about, is how do we create a time where we actually sit around the dinner table without technology and eat together. And we do that a lot of the time, but this season do we do this like every single night? This is going to be a ritual that we'll try to incorporate. Now, I have to confess, last night, I didn't stick to this ritual. My wife was in Mexico helping out at a clinic, and so it was just me and the boys. So we did partly. We had salad together, and then we watched Star Wars and ate meals. So it wasn't very religious. We don't stick to it a ton. There may be a family ritual or tradition that you can incorporate. And I don't mean sitting your child down and reading them the King James version of a 2-hour story or jamming religion down their throat. I mean, is there something you can do that's in a way different, that lets them know we're entering in this season a little differently? I know they have Advent calendars. They have little things that you can do or read. And these are all different ways. Perhaps it's a technology fast. No, he didn't just suggest that. Yes, I did. Perhaps it's maybe that'd be healthy for a lot of us with all the stuff going on right now. It's just like, I'm just going to set aside. I'm not going to look at Facebook or Twitter or whatever else there is out there. I'm just going to ignore that for this time. I'm going to take this season in quiet contemplation. Maybe it's turning off the radio to and from work. If we're looking for times to be silent, and we all drive to and from work, maybe it's taking that time to just say, how do I silence this time? How do I turn off the noise? I know somebody who is leaving for work a little earlier and listening to classical music, because we found that many of us, in the midst of driving to work with all the traffic and everything else, we get to work and we're stressed already, right? We're like, I barely got here, and the people and the traffic. So maybe it just means leaving a little earlier so that when you arrive at work, you have more patience. You're there, you're present. Okay, I'm here. Again, practical stuff. The last one, maybe it just means walking more slowly during our shopping. So I wrote all of these down, actually, and then I was working on something else for a while, and I went to Costco, and I totally did not live exactly what I was saying. So I was in Costco, and I was looking for something. It was like this bag of nuts, and I couldn't find it. And so when that happens, then I get frustrated, and then I start walking faster, and then I start pacing back and forth, and I'm like, where are these nuts? I can't find them. And then I was like, what? What are you doing, Aaron? Like, you're in Costco, you're getting frustrated over nuts. Big deal. And I looked at my watch, and it was like I have over a half an hour before I have to be somewhere, creating margins, right? Why am I feeling rushed or stressed? I'm causing myself this. So all it took was that, becoming aware, and then I just, okay. So I just went on, and I found the other things. I never found the nuts, but it was all right? But just that little bit of reframing, that's all it took for me to go from, I feel really stressful over nuts, which is ridiculous, but I did, right? And feeling frustrated to, okay, I carry myself in a more patient, calm, contemplative way. Like, I'm here. I get to shop. I get to go to Costco. Thank goodness for Costco. Advent is an invitation to wait patiently in contemplation in order to cultivate an awareness of what God wants to birth in our lives, in your life, in the lives of those around us. More and more I'm understanding that contemplation, I think, is the first act of whatever else we do. Meaning, contemplative artist, contemplative prophet, contemplative whatever it else, that it must be born out of this place of prayer, of somehow being quiet, of finding our center, of being centered people, and then acting out of that. And Advent invites us into that time. As I close, I wanted to read a short excerpt, a quote out of a book I recently read called The Contemplative Pastor. It was written by a man named Eugene Peterson. And he says this, he wrote, "The assumption of spirituality is that God is doing something before I know it. So the task is not to get God to do something I think needs to be done, but to become aware of what God is doing so that I can respond to it." participate in it, and take delight in it. Really, spirituality is primarily about becoming aware. What is God doing in our life? What is the season calling us to? What is God speaking in our life? And often within the busyness, what happens is we kind of tag on our prayers, like, God help that person, God do this, God please give me direction here. And we're just asking God to move and do. And then the Advent season actually calls us to wait, to be still, open ourselves up to what God may be speaking and doing in our life. It's an intentional way of entering into the season that's very different. It's subversive. It's going beneath the surface of often the craziness and the chaos of life.